Well, would you look at this? Hey there, how's it going? My name is David and you're watching Kai City RC. Thanks for coming back to the channel today. Now this is part 3 of my GeForce Genova build and review. So if you haven't seen part 1 and part 2, I'll put a link in the description below. You should probably go and watch those first and then come back here. So as you can see, I finished the chassis, painted the body, and I've got to say I'm really liking how the finished buggy looks. To borrow a phrase from Glenn over at Tamiya Legends, it's a thing of beauty. Well, at least I think so. Let me know what you think in the comments. Now, it would be nice if GeForce added some more metal parts here and there, some anodized aluminium, for example, a bit of carbon fiber, you know, a splash of color perhaps to add a little bling to an otherwise completely monotone chassis. But body-wise, yeah, I think they've nailed it. Now, you can clearly see the retro vintage design influences, and I think at first glance many people would be forgiven for thinking this is some kind of re-release, but it's not. It's a whole new buggy by a new player in the assembly RC market. I think that's a win-win personally. Now, I think from any angle this is a good looking buggy, but I particularly like the side-on view. It just looks so long, low and sleek. It's funny, today as I was running the buggy at the park, a thought popped into my head. I don't know about anybody else, but it really reminds me of a Colonial Viper from Battlestar Galactica. I don't know, this is something very similar about the design. And you know, I don't think you can get much more retro than that. So overall, I'm really loving how the Genova looks. But what about how it performs? Okay, so, right, well, there's something I feel I need to make clear before I start. I am by no stretch of the imagination a pro racer, or for that matter, much of a racer at all. Now, I do occasionally run at local tracks where I would consider myself average at best. Most of my running happens at local parks, such as the one I'm at now, one I'm at earlier today. So as such, I don't feel I'm very qualified to give a fair assessment of its handling prowess, or lack thereof, to someone wanting to know if this would be competitive at their local circuit. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, race enthusiasts, take this review with a large grain of salt. But that said, I'd imagine the vast majority of the people watching this video, and indeed my channel as a whole, are more into the building and collecting and running for fun aspects of RC, rather than how fast it can get around a circuit. So with that disclaimer out of the way, what can I tell you about how well it drives and handles compared to, say, vintage Tamiya re-releases or Kyosho designs? Well, I really wanted to give this the fairest comparison possible, and I wanted to add as much credibility and meaning to the review as I could. So I decided to set up a concourse at my local park and run the Genova back-to-back against my most suitable competitor, the Tamiya DT02MS. I chose the DT02 because it's by far my most modern design buggy that I own, and the specs on paper at least are quite closely matched the Genova. So the MS Special has several hop-ups over the standard DT02, including what we got: TRF dampers, turnbuckles, ball diff, and universals, to name but a few. Now mine is fitted with a super stock motor. I should mention that my DT02MS is by far my most used RC. I've put many hours on this chassis, and it's been my go-to buggy whenever I visit off-road circuits. So as such, it's seen better days. The body is beat to hell and there isn't much left of the wing. I did a full rebuild and overhaul on the chassis earlier this year, but I have yet to replace the wing, so that's why it's looking rather strange. I suspect picking up MS Special decals is going to be a challenge. What else? For the comparison, I put the kit tires back on the DT02. They're quite similar, quite close in compound and design to the Genovas. So after running them back to back around the concourse, what can I tell you? Well, straight line speed performance is irrelevant considering they both have very different setups. But if you're curious, the Genova with a GeForce brushless ESC and a 17.5 turn motor was noticeably slower than the Tamiya with a super stock. Now they're both running nickel metal hydride batteries, which I suspect may be hindering the performance of the brushless setups. I say that because I found that all of my buggies running brushless run much slower than what the motor tone would suggest. So I'm guessing my nickel metal hydride batteries, my NIMs, just don't have the oomph needed to get the most out of the brushless setup. Now, while the DTO2 would win in the drag race, it was a totally different matter on the corners. The Genova had much better initial turn-in and suffered way less understeer. I found I could brake later, turn in sharper, and get on the power quicker with the Genova. Now, the Genova also felt a lot more stable on rougher terrain, but on the straights, the DTO2 would catch up. Now, I'd say the Genova is one of the fastest two-wheel drive buggies I have, but once again, pretty much all of the buggies that I own are vintage re-releases of old designs. But the standout feature for me was just how easy the Genova is to jump. A lot of vintage design buggies can be quite tricky to jump well, to keep the buggy flat through the air without nose diving. Now, up until now, the DTO2 was probably the easiest buggy I owned to jump neutrally, naturally. But the Genova is a step above that. Indeed, I found it difficult to even try and upset the balance in midair. It just naturally jumped really well. Now, at the park I frequent the most during the summer months, as it's one of the few places that regularly cut the grass, there is a patch of an uneven terrain with grass with some dips and undulations that I would like to run all my buggies across. Now, if you've watched a lot of my recent running videos, you'll probably know the patch I'm talking about. The rough patch really upsets the suspension, and it's always interesting to see how the different setups handle it. Now, most of the older buggies will want to flip rear over front or roll when hitting the jumps at speed. In fact, you can see that most on like the Terra Scorcher or most recently my Frog video, which should be live by now. So thus far, of the vintage designs anyway, the only one that's kind of unstable is the fighting buggy, and I think that's in part due to the heavy rear end and the shock design. Everything else really gets unbalanced. With that in mind, I thought I'd run the Genova over and just see how well it does. Well, the Genova sailed over it like it wasn't even there. Now, is that due to the better shocks? Is it due to the longer wheelbase? Chassis balance? I couldn't tell you. Okay, so moving on. A common question I've been asked is, do you think the Genova will be made available in markets outside of Japan? And I'm in no position to make any comment one way or the other, but I think it would be fair to say that G-Force are probably watching closely to see how well the Genova does in Japan before making any decision. Now, it's still early days here. The buggy has been out for about 3 weeks. It came out at the end of July 2022. But the vibe I'm getting here is that it's not proving too popular. In Japan at least anyway. Most of the criticism seems to be leveled at the price more than anything else. I think many of the club racers, the high-end buggy owners, feel the design is under par for their needs and regular track use. Now, I'm sure they're right, but the Genova is also significantly cheaper than the majority of modern high-end buggies, especially when you factor in things like they usually don't come with wheels and tires, etc., etc. And then flip that over from a novice's point of view, it's quite expensive as an entry point into the hobby. So that may put, a lot of potential buyers off as well. Added to that, I think that as this is something totally new from G-Force, many people perhaps harbor concerns in the back of their mind as to whether G-Force will continue to offer spares and support for this buggy, or indeed even to continue to expand their assembly RC catalogue in the future. For me personally, I'm really rooting for G-Force Hobby and the Genova to be a success. I think it's great, especially given the current, economic turmoil around the world, that the manufacturer is trying something new and entering an established niche market with a completely new offering. Now, of course, if they offer something that is poorly designed, fragile, and lacking, then I feel, as someone who's putting out a review to the wider world, as I am doing now, it is my duty to point these things out. But to my mind, other than the price of the kit and the spares, incidentally, spares seem to be about 40 to 50% more expensive than the equivalent Tamiya spares for, say, the TD2. The buggy itself is really well thought out. It's really well designed, and the materials are of a very high quality, high standard for the price. So anyway, it's just some food for thought. Now, I'll wrap this up here by speaking to whom I believe are the vast majority of the viewers subscribed to my channel. People such as myself, RC enthusiasts who grew up in the golden era of RC, who can now afford to buy all those kits we lusted after as a kid. We're not really that much into racing, but we enjoy building, modifying, collecting and running our RCs, you know, in the backyard at the local park, and perhaps even at the local track for some light-hearted racing. To those people, should you buy and import at this point a Genova? Is it worth getting this over the TD2, or perhaps a re-release like the VQS or the Terra Scorcher, or for a little bit more money, the Kyosho Beetle or Scorpion? Now that's a tough one to answer. Me personally, while the Genova has this wonderful retro styling and all the benefits of the modern design, I'd argue it lacks the nostalgia and the emotional connection that many of us have to the buggies that we really wanted as a kid. Now the Genova is nice and it handles well and it looks the part, but I have to ask myself, given the choice between the Genova and say a re-released original Astute or a Super Astute or even a Madcap, which one would I get? Well, I know which one I'll be adding to my collection. Well, that's all from me on the Genova. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you give me a thumbs up. I'll be back sometime soon with some more RC content. Till then, happy RCing, and I'll see you in the next one. My name is David and you've been watching Kai City RC.